Well, the title of the talk today is From Luther to Tomlin, a Corpus Analysis of Harmony and Melody in Congregational Songs of the American Evangelical Church. A second title that I've used for a pastor's conference that I spoke at, is We Want to Sing, but Why Today's Congregational Song is in Need of a Serious Reformation. It was around the 500th anniversary. So it's sort of, we're going to be talking about congregational singing based on research that I've done, a corpus analysis of harmony and melody. Keith and Kristen Getty's new book, Sing, How Worship Transforms Your Life, Family, and Church, explains both the importance of and practical application of congregational singing in church worship. The opening chapters of the book present reasons why Christians should sing. As they state first, human beings are created to sing. Quote, "Your ability to sing is fearfully and wonderfully made. Around the 12-week mark, the vocal cords of a baby growing in the womb are in place and have been shown to work long before the baby is born. We may sound different, but each of us has the same vocal apparatus. Breath flowing up from our lungs, vibrating through vocal cords in our throat, and pushing sound out through the articulators of our mouth, tongues, and lips. Singing is not merely a happy byproduct of God's real intent of making us creatures who can speak. It is something we're designed to be able to do." Secondly, they say Christians are commanded to sing. As they state repeatedly and throughout Scripture, we are commanded to be a singing people. There are more than 400 references to singing in the Bible and at least 50 direct commands. We are not to disregard the command because we don't like the music or the personnel or are not in the mood. The command in Psalm 149:1 contains no caveats or conditions. And that verse says, "Sing to the Lord a new song, his praise in the assembly of the saints." Third, Christians should feel compelled to sing. They say that it goes against the grain of how God created our humanity for us to keep from praising all that is praiseworthy, to keep quiet about what we are pleased with. Since God is most worthy of our praise above all other people, we will respond not only by knowing we should praise him, but by feeling we cannot help but praise him, for it is our joy to do so as well as our duty. And singing is one of the greatest ways we have to complete the enjoyment of all that the Lord has done for us and even more for who he is. In recent years, there has been much written about the decline of participation in congregational singing in the church. This is an issue in the modern church that has been too long neglected, as seen by the numerous quotes from leaders in the opening section of this book. Here are a few things being said about this book, Sing. Mike Harland, director of Lifeway Worship Resource, said, "Somewhere along the way, it seems the Western church began to believe that singing was for singers. With this book, the Gettys have brought us back to the essential truth that singing is for believers. Once we understand that, the question, do you have a voice, changes to, do you have a song? Sing helps us discover all the reasons God put a new song in our hearts the moment we met him." Ligon Duncan, president of Reformed Theological Seminary, states, quote, "If there is an area in special need of reformation in the worship of evangelical churches, it is congregational singing. I am so thankful for the Gettys' heart for this vital aspect of our communion with God. People and pastors alike need to read Sing." And finally, John MacArthur notes that the Gettys are a precious benediction from heaven to enrich our praise. They have been used by the Lord to provide theologically rich, singable music for the church in this generation. From the resounding praise for this recent book, it is clear that the topic of congregational singing deserves serious attention. This is the issue that I wish to address here today. I've heard multiple reasons for why there's an overall decline in congregational participation in singing. Most of those reasons focus on the heart of individual congregants. If they would just stop focusing on their own wants and desires, then they would sing more. While I believe there is some truth to that, I do not believe that the fault of not singing lies solely with the individual congregants. More and more I hear people of all ages say that they enjoy singing in the church and want to participate, but they simply are not able to for various reasons. First, they do not know the song, or it is too high or too low, or it is difficult to figure out what to sing when. In short, the singability of a song for corporate worship is a major factor in the overall participation of a congregant. In order to assess the singability of a song, we need to evaluate musical aspects such as harmony, melody, rhythm, and vocal range. I believe that examination of these aspects of our congregational songs have been sorely lacking, but point to a major reason for the decline of congregational participation in corporate worship. Now, it is often said that music is the universal language. While I do not agree that it is universal, music truly is a language and is learned as such. For instance, Language study starts with learning letters and pitches, which are combined to form, or letters, which would be related to pitches, which are combined to form words, or what we would think musically as chords, which are then combined to form phrases and sentences. There are also rules of grammar and syntax to learn, similar to chord functions within a musical phrase. Finally, one studies literary classics, much like analysis of musical compositions, to see how the masters utilized their language. Now, languages have been around for millennia, and over time, all have undergone changes in expression and vocabulary. John McWhorter, in his 2003 book, Doing Our Own Thing, The Degradation of Language and Music and Why We Should, Care, discusses the swift and startling change in written and oral communication in American culture emanating from the countercultural revolution of the 1960s, resulting in a near total loss of formal expression through language. As he explains, I have claimed that the United States has undergone a shift in its relationship to self-expression that has had an effect beyond anything traceable to education or larger currents of intellectual history. The musical sensibility of most Americans of boomer age and younger parallels their sense of language, preferring the visceral, spontaneous, and elementary over the objective, planned, and elaborated. As McWhorter states, the default music in early 20th century America was classical music, and what one listened for in that music is much different than today. He says that the two main elements the listener pricked up their ears to were melody and harmony. Rhythm was garnish. Today, however, the American typically listens mainly for two things: rhythm and the vernacular authenticity of the singer's vocal tone. Certainly, we haven't tossed out melody and harmony altogether, but we can do without them if the beat is fine enough. Because rhythm is the driving musical factor in much music today, pieces tend toward an oral, improvisatory tradition, as opposed to written down compositions with long melodic lines and rich harmonies. He states that most pop today is driven less by what the composer writes down than the performer taking raw materials and fashioning it into an individually charismatic performance. In the same way, speech is immediate and personal when uttered, but loses its power when transcribed word for word on paper, denuded of its situational context and the nuances that intonation conveys. New pop is spoken music. Old pop was much more written down. McWhorter points to pop rock groups in the 1960s as transitional in this shift away from melody and harmony and toward rhythm. He states that most of the people who followed in the Beatles' wake carried on the rhythmic addiction, the black-inflected diction, and the cheeky informality, but didn't bother with the artistic constraint. And because a culture busy getting down no longer required real songs, America ate this music up such that today, a good 2 generations have grown up with a musical sensibility based on beat and shaggy vocal passion. That is, whatever residual response one has to the melody and harmony, take away the beat and the cool voice, and we lose interest, while music based entirely on melody and harmony appeals only to the few. Based on these assessments, it is evident that music in American culture since the 1960s has undergone a dramatic shift similar to that of language. So how has this dramatic change in music and secular American culture affected music in American evangelical churches? Do we find the same trends of secular music happening with congregational music in recent years? Something that I think we can all agree on is that congregational songs sung in the average American evangelical church today are quite different from congregational songs sung 50 years ago. However, something that has not yet been fully studied is precisely what is different between traditional hymnody and previous generations and contemporary worship songs. Now, several notable studies have focused on lyrical differences between hymns and contemporary worship songs. For instance, Lester Ruth, who's a research professor of Christian worship at Duke Divinity School, he published a recent article comparing the lyrical differences between evangelical hymns, roughly 1810 to 1960, and contemporary worship songs, 1989 to 2015. And that would be in Artistic Theologian, so go check out that article from Lester Ruth. He talks particularly about the references to Trinitarian content and the differences between these. Also, The Message in the Music, Studying Contemporary Praise and Worship, published in 2007, devotes 10 chapters focusing on lyrical and musical content of the 77 most popular contemporary worship songs from 1989 to 2005. However, to date, there is not a published study focusing on precise differences in the music between traditional hymnody and contemporary worship songs. The Corpus analysis presented here today helps to pinpoint musical differences between hymnody and contemporary worship songs, and provides a clearer picture as to why many contemporary worship songs actually hinder congregational participation in singing. My research represents a corpus analysis of 260 songs currently sung in American evangelical churches, based on rank lists from Christian Copyright Licensing International, much more known as CCLI. The corpus is a combination of CCLI's 100 most popular public domain songs, CCLI's semi-annual top 25 song lists, which began in 1989, and CCLI's currently ranked top 100 songs as of August 2017. And I state that because they are changing rapidly, and so I'm letting you know the corpus I was looking at was the end of last year, and these were the currently ranked top 100 songs. The analytical study focuses primarily on musical aspects of harmony, including the number of chords and chordal inversions used, and melody, including the range of the melodic line and the original printed key for each song. The study also examines the rhythm of the melodic line in specific songs, and this is an area where I'm continuing to develop and trying to figure out a way to present the rhythm in an objective fashion, but I'll show you some of the things that I'm working on. The first aspect of the corpus study deals with harmony. In his article, Looking at Hymn Tunes, the Objective Factors, John Wilson points to various musical aspects that make a good hymn tune. Regarding harmony, Wilson states that, quote, harmony will be accounted successful if it enriches the melodic experience and if it is helpful, if only subconsciously, to the singer. He discusses the use of specific harmonies that provide interesting moments within a hymn tune. Harmony can also induce or hint at a change of key, even when the melody does not insist on it. This we would see as chromatic harmony, such as a 5 of 5 or things like that. Similarly, the use of a particular harmony can create a momentary radiance in the melody. In other words, harmony is used for dramatic purpose as well as providing interest to the melody. To that end, the first consideration in the corpus study was to analyze the harmonies in each of the 260 songs. The analysis includes a tabulation of the number of unique chords used in a song, as well as the number of chordal inversions. Now, in this, I didn't study the number of times that a chord occurs. So, for instance, the tonic chord is considered a tonic chord, whether it happens once or 25 times in a song. The greater the number of chords and chordal inversions used in a song, the more interesting musical vocabulary the song inherently possesses. Now, the harmonies for each song were entered into a spreadsheet. I'm just showing you page 1 of 7. Okay, so I'm showing you how this is all working. We're not going to look at the spreadsheet necessarily, but I want to show you what it is. So I enter the harmonies for each song in the spreadsheet along with the chord count for root position chords, inverted chords, and chromatic chords. So as you can see here, they're arranged chronologically based on when the song was harmonized. Then I'm giving the number of unique root chords, number of unique chordal inversions, the number of chromatic chords, and then I actually list the harmonies here, whether they have added seventh to them or added ninth, whatever it might be, and then these would be the chromatic chords. The songs were arranged, like I said, chronologically based on the year they were originally harmonized in order to show potential changes in harmonic usage over time. The songs were then compiled into 3 time periods which show changes in harmony and melody over time. Let me make sure I got that up there. There we go. So first time period are 100 songs in public domain and or written prior to 1955. Things prior to 1923 are in public domain, but there are 3 songs that we would consider to be part of that traditional hymnody, such as How Great Thou Art. I believe Victory in Jesus is one of the other ones. I lumped those into traditional hymnody up to 1955. The second time period represents 46 songs written from 1955 to 1987. And then the third period is 114 songs written in the last 30 years, 1988 to 2017. So the first boundary encompasses traditional hymnody. The second boundary point reflects clear harmonic and melodic changes that occur in songs written before and after 1987. So there are several interesting results from the harmonic analysis. First, the vast majority of songs written prior to 1988, that would be the first 2 time periods, 146 songs, they utilize at least 2 chord inversions, and they span a fairly wide range of chords used from 3 to 8 chords. So as you look at this chart, this shows how many unique chords there are, the number of unique chordal inversions. This would be rather simplistic. This would be very complex. Okay, so the more you go down that chart, the more complex it is. As we see, the first 2 time periods, there's a general swath throughout, but that would be the majority of songs there. And you can see down here, tabulation, at least 2 chordal inversions, and between 3 to 8 chords. Conversely, harmonies used in a majority of songs from 1988 to 2017 are predominantly in root position, and there are fewer chords in general. So as you look at this is the songs from the last 30 years. This is the majority that we're seeing, either root position up to 2 chordal inversions. The main one would be 1-6. We might get a 5-6 as well, and a combination of both. And then 4 to 5 chords, again, showing you the majority of songs that are happening there. This overwhelming use of root position chords in contemporary worship songs in recent decades is also seen in rock music, based on findings from the Corpus analysis of rock harmony in de Klerk Temperley 2011. They actually look at the top 100 songs, rock songs from 1950 to 2000, and their results show an overwhelming use of root position chords as well. So both the number of chords used and the number of inversions used in songs from 1988 to 2017 have dramatically decreased from songs prior to 1988. Second, the majority of songs written prior to 1988 use at least one chromatic chord. Now I'm going to show you all 7 sheets, and I want you to focus on this area here. The chromatic chords are what Wilson points to a momentary radiance or a change of key. This provides more interesting harmony as opposed to just simply diatonic chords. As you look through this, I'm going to just show you all the 7 pages of this. As we go through the chart, we're down to 1887, 1953. You'll notice all the chromatic chords. There's a good amount of the songs have them. Even through 1984, we're seeing quite a few chromatic chords happening. After 1988, we see a dramatic change. And as I go through, we see not a single chord, or not a single song in the corpus uses a chromatic chord, just simply diatonic. So the use of chromatic chords show a more complex harmonic. Use of the 6-7 and 4-7, actually along with the 3-7 and 2-7, we see a lot more of the 7th chords happening with 2 and 3 as well, is perhaps an influence of jazz harmony on contemporary worship songwriters. Not really sure, I didn't research that much, but it is interesting that we get chains of 7th chords happening after 1955, quite a bit of that. Finally, the use of the 5-7 chord abruptly drops in songs written after 1987. This is where my theory nerd kicks in. The loss of the chordal 7th tendency tone weakens the cadential motion towards the tonic chord, or the tonic substitute chord 6. So I'm going to show you, and I'll play it for you. As we move along, when we get to a 5-7 chord, there's 2 tendency tones that move out. Or we get that's the expected resolution or the deceptive resolution. Okay? By removing the chordal 7th, the resolution to the subdominant chord becomes a viable option based on a single tendency tone 7 to 1 in the dominant triad. So if we take out the 7th, but because we don't have that tendency tone, we could go here as well. So by removing that, we actually provide a third resolution of that 5 chord as a triad. This progression, 5 to 4, while a rarity in common practice tonality and hymnody, is used frequently in recent songs, both sacred and secular. Temperley and de Klerk also in their rock harmony discuss the prevalence of the 5 to 4 to 1 progression in rock harmony, which we see a lot more in songs recently, where instead of moving from 5 to 1 or 5 to 6, we move 5 back to 4, and if we think in terms of the phrase model, it's actually a retrogression from moving from the dominant to the tonic or the tonic substitute. And so this is an interesting aspect that the 5-7 has gone completely by the wayside, which then allows them to move to the 4 chord as opposed to 1 or 6. From the harmonic analysis, it is clear that the vast majority of songs written after 1987 utilize a much simpler harmonic structure than previous songs, both in the number of chords used as well as the number of chordal inversions. Because of this, because harmony has become rather simplistic, this is a rough sketch of what happens. Because harmony has become rather simplistic, there is a greater tendency to add complexity elsewhere to create musical interest. That complexity most often comes in the form of melodic rhythm. Unfortunately, this kind of complexity makes it much more difficult for a group of people to sing together, since it becomes much harder to line up the individual notes with each other. Regarding rhythm, Wilson points out in his article on hymn tunes that, quote, "We must remember that singing is not just an affair of the voice. It is just as much, if not more, an affair of the mind. A good voice and plenty of breath are fine things to have, but if you cannot imagine in your mind's ear the pitch of the next note in a tune, you cannot sing it. And in matters of rhythm, if you cannot visualize the length of a note, you will not know when to stop singing it, which may be just as awkward." And I have been there myself, where I hold a note too long or start going somewhere else too quickly, and nobody else is joining me, and that gets awkward in hymn singing. And you stop singing. A largely unskilled congregation is going to have a hard time learning tricky rhythms, especially if there is no sheet music to follow. Based on the Corpus study, melodic notes in traditional hymns almost always land on a beat or are equally divided within a beat. Conversely, melodic notes in many of the contemporary worship songs displace the regular beat by an eighth or a 16th note. Unfortunately, this kind of melodic complexity makes it difficult for a group of people to sing together, since it becomes harder to line up the beat-displaced notes with other singers, creating a hindrance to congregational participation. This is not to say that a congregation can't learn it, but it's going to take more effort to line those things up than what we see with traditional hymnody. So now we're going to do a little quiz type thing. We're going to take a look at melodic rhythm of some popular hymns as an examples of traditional hymns rhythm versus contemporary song rhythm. So our first one, and this is actually a reharmonized version of this song, but as we look at this song, anybody know what this might be? A Mighty Fortress. Okay, ta 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 ta. Okay, so Mighty Fortress. Here's another example on 4/4. Ta 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 ta. And can it be? Ta 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 ta. Okay. Very simplistic rhythmically, right? As we just look at these. Okay. Next one. Ta 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 ta. Great is thy faithfulness. Notice the phrase structure of great is thy faithfulness. Basically the same thing 4 times. So there's a consistency in the phrase structure. Okay. Ta 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 ta. Oh, Caroline, what? Do you know it? Ta 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 ta. His name is wonderful. Yeah, so this one again, even though there's some more elaborate rhythm, it's the same thing over and over. Okay, here's one, very straightforward rhythm. Ta, 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 ta. When I survey, okay? Now look at the difference between this. Chris Tomlin in 2000 adds a chorus to When I Survey. Very simple rhythm in the verse, and then we move to the chorus, okay? So we could all try to taw this together. It's going to be much more difficult to taw that together. We see a lot of eighth note displaced rhythms. Now that's not to say that the congregation can't learn it, but it's going to take more than one run through to work to get everybody to sing this together. Okay? Similarly, this one is about as simplistic of a rhythm as you can get. Ta 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 ta. Oh God, our help in ages past. Okay? Now, 1988, we add a chorus to Oh God, our help in ages past. And now we get the quarter note triplets. We get beat displaced rhythms here. So we're going to get 16th and 8th note displaced rhythms. Again, not that the congregation can't learn it, but it's going to take more effort to get that together. Now we'll just take a look at some of the recent songs. Okay, this one shows God of Wonders, 2000. And these are songs that I've sung in congregations before, and you can get the congregation to learn it, but it's going to take a lot more effort. Okay? This one's an interesting one because the entire verse is an 8th note displaced beat. So you gotta ta 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 ta. Not a single time in Your Grace is Enough do we land until we get to the pre-chorus. Okay, here's another one. This is The Stand, 2005. You'll notice too that the phrases aren't exactly the same, and so you can't latch onto something in the first phrase to hold on to the next phrase. And then finally, this one, which is a great song. Again, the phrases don't always line up together, so again, it's going to take a little bit longer to put them together. Come As You Are, we've sung it in chapel. Again, you can learn it, but it is harder to get that together. Okay, so you're noticing a lot of the contemporary songs will have beat-displaced units, beat-displaced by 16th or 8th notes. That's going to take a lot longer to figure those out as a congregation, a lot more complex. So the melodic rhythm has become dramatically more complex in the last 30 years as harmonies have become much simpler. This has created a hindrance to congregational participation as people struggle to figure out when to sing notes. In addition, because harmonic structure is so simplistic, part singing has become all but non-existent, which means everyone is now singing the melody. This poses another challenge, as we shall see. So when evaluating a hymn tune, Wilson mentioned several attributes that the most successful tunes possess. First, the hymn tune will have a judicious or thought-out mixture of leaps and steps. Second, it will maintain its poise as it moves, balancing rise and fall without spending too long on the heights or in the depths. And third, it will respect congregational limits in matter of pitch and vocal climax. And here the concern must be as much with average pitch level as with the highest notes reached. He goes on to state, the pitch of the highest acceptable note depends on so many factors, both psychological and vocal, that generalization is difficult. For unison singing in a mixed congregation, a top E is only just acceptable if all the conditions are good. What is important to singers, if they are to make the extra effort, is the appropriate placing of the high note and the way it is approached. The average vocal range when everyone is singing melody is roughly B flat 3 to D5, which is about an octave plus a third. Any higher, altos and basses will have a difficult time singing. And even at D5, if staying around it too long, having a high tessitura, they're going to have trouble maintaining that. Any lower than B3, tenors and sopranos may have a difficult time singing as well. So in addition to analyzing the harmonic structure in each of the songs of the corpus, I also analyzed the melodic range for each song in their original printed key. The melodic range includes the highest and lowest notes sung in the melody, which was then entered into a graph with the songs in chronological order. And now we're going to show a zoomed in version, but this is all the songs from the harmonic thing, and the graph goes like into the library. It's that long, but this shows like page 1 of 5. As the graph shows, the melodic range is shaded in gray. The light gray areas are places the pitch only reaches that place once in the music. So if it's dark gray, it's sung at least twice in the music, the highest and lowest notes. Okay. So this graph is a zoomed in version in order to demonstrate changes of the melodic motion over time. I'm going to actually play through this graph, and you're going to see, not play, but play it on the computer. The blue area is that average vocal range, B flat to D. We're going to see what happens over time with this, if I can get it to play. I can't even see the play on here. Oh, here we go. Cool. So you'll see the years up there, and you'll notice most of the songs are fitting within that. Okay, even through 1900, about 1935, Wonderful Grace of Jesus has that lovely high G. Okay, it's like the one anomaly. Okay, as we go to 1975, we actually see there's a shrinking a little bit. There's a few anomalies here and there. Even through the 90s, it's not so bad, but look what happens after the year 2000. E5 becomes a standard. We move all the way up to F, F sharp 5, and G5. We're seeing much more songs reach those heights. And in the last 5 years, things have really gotten crazy. Wow. Okay? As you look at these last 5 years, a lot of songs are getting high in their original key. We also see there's a few that are hitting down to the G level. And so we see much more variety in the original printed key, much higher in the original printed key. As the graph shows, the melodic range for the vast majority of songs up to the year 2000 stay within the comfortable range for average congregants. After the year 2000, however, the melodic range both expands and shifts higher, with the majority of songs reaching E to F sharp and even G5, particularly in the last 5 to 10 years. Now this graph tabulates the vocal extremes in the melodic line of these songs, grouped into the 3 time periods. And I actually grouped the last time period into 2 sub-periods to show the change at the year 2000. Prior to 2000, almost 90% of the melodies were within the comfortable singing range. This shows you the lowest note within songs, the highest note within songs. Okay? And you'll notice through that, up to the year 2000, 90% of those melodies were within the comfortable singing range. However, after 2000, there's a dramatic shift, both upwards and downwards, such that when we look at this graph, and this is taking into account just the number of songs in here, that 71.3% of the songs in their original key are above the comfortable melodic range. This means that the majority of these songs were not written for congregational participation in mind based on their original printed key. Now, songs can be transposed down or up in order to provide a more comfortable vocal range for songs, and indeed that is the case for some songs. So this graph shows how large the melodic range is based on semitones or half steps. If the range of a melody is 16 half steps or lower, then that song can be transposed into a key that will allow the melody to lie within the comfortable melodic range. However, even after transposition, Almost more than 20% of the songs written after the year 2000 still have melodies that lie outside the comfortable range. Based on this, it's evident that these songs were not written for congregations to sing. We see a lot that are happening at 17 semitones, so you can maybe get with that, but there's a good 10 songs, 19, all the way up to 24. That's 2 full octaves. So no matter what key you put that in, there is no way that a melodic singing is going to sing 2 full octaves, unless you're professional singers, and last time I checked, most congregations were not made of professional singers. Let's see. Even though many songs can be transposed to fit a comfortable melodic range, worship leaders do not often take advantage of this, but rather sing the song in the original key. This is due in large part to the instrumentation used for worship. In looking at the original key for each song, there's a shift from flat key areas to sharp key areas since 1987. Prior to 1955, the majority of songs were written in flat key areas, with the rest up to C, D, or G. One song was written in A, but of those 100 songs, mostly were in flat key areas. In the 1955 to 1986, we see much the same idea. But after 1987, the majority of songs written have shifted to sharp key areas, and in fact, almost 40% of those songs are using keys of 3 or more sharps. Those would be the keys of A, E, B, and F sharp. So why the reversal of keys from flat key areas to sharp key areas? Well, prior to the 1980s, the main instrumentation in churches was for organ or piano, along with orchestral instruments. Particularly with orchestras, flat key areas work much better, and when we think of instruments of transposition, such as the clarinet and B flat. However, after the 1980s, as guitars increasingly have become the dominant instrument, the key areas have changed to reflect guitar-led instrumentation. The sharp key areas reflect the open strings of the guitar, G, D, A, E, and B. Those keys make up 63% of the original key areas of songs written after 1987. And close to 40 of those songs are in the keys of A, E, B, and F sharp. Those keys, those 4 keys, inevitably push the melodic range higher. Think about it. Most melodies go up to the 5th scale degree or the octave in whatever key you're in. So in the keys of A and E, that would be to the high E. And then the keys of B and F sharp, that would be up to the F sharp. In other words, the guitar-led instrumentation has caused more songwriters to write in keys for guitarists, which in turn causes melody lines to be shifted up based on the best key areas for guitar playing. Those same key areas, however, are quite difficult for orchestral instruments, particularly instruments of transposition. A clarinet in B flat is going to not be happy when you pick a key in the key of B, because they're going to have 7 sharps. And Matt, you can attest to this. If we would lower it to B flat, we're now in 0 sharps. Okay, so as we think of orchestral instruments, these keys make it much more difficult for them. So in conclusion, as the Corpus study shows, the music of congregational songs has changed dramatically in recent years in regards to harmony, melody, and rhythm. For the most part, these changes have had a negative effect on congregational participation in singing by creating hindrances to singing. These hindrances include stagnant harmony, which offer little help to congregants to aid memory and discourages singing in parts; overly complex rhythm in the melody, which causes congregants to be unsure when to sing each note; too large of a melodic range, which creates difficulty singing portions of the melody; and poor choice of key area, which causes parts of the melody to sit too high or too low for the average congregant. In order to promote active participation from congregants, we need to do better in choosing what I call congregational-friendly songs. Songs that are congregational-friendly are songs with an interesting melody that utilize both steps and leaps, songs with harmonies that enhance the melody, songs with fairly straightforward rhythms in the melody, songs with a melodic range not larger than an octave and a third, and songs that are transposed if needed to fit within the comfortable melodic range of the average congregant. With current technology, we have easy access to an overwhelming number of songs to choose from for congregational singing. It can be difficult at times to decide what to sing. There are pressures from multiple sides, from individual congregants to praise team members to pastoral staff, to choose certain types of songs in order to appeal to a specific demographic in the church. Of utmost importance, however, is to choose songs that allow our congregation to actively participate in corporate worship through singing, while avoiding songs that are a hindrance musically and theologically. For the sake of the body of Christ, we can choose better songs. No, we should choose better songs. No, we must choose better songs. Thank you.
All right, questions, I have one question.
Mm-hmm.
So, how much do you think of the effect of like tenors and sopranos becoming the dominant vocal parts as compared to basses and altos, like Johnny Cash used to be a major singer?
Right.
Do you think that plays into this?
It definitely does. And what I've found is that typically recording artists are either going to be tenors, and particularly high tenors if we think of Chris Tomlin's songs, or they're going to be low altos. And so both of those don't play well for an average congregant, so we need to transpose those songs. For instance, Indescribable, its original key is B flat, which goes into the rafters. So you have to bring that down at least a third in order for the average congregant to sing it. What's happening, I see, is that as worship leaders are listening to CDs or choosing songs based on what they're hearing on the radio or seeing from CDs, they are not necessarily thinking about where that should fit in with the average congregant, especially if they can sing it. More worship leaders, if they're tenors, are going to have an easier time singing them, but may not realize that that's going to be harder for some other people to sing. But I do think that having high tenors recording is making it difficult for we're starting to try to emulate those tenors or those high singers. Yeah, John.
Why 1955?
Okay, so the reason I have that date, and it could bend. The only reason is there's 3 songs within the corpus that are considered traditional hymnody, but they're written like in the early 1950s. I think it was, I can't remember what song. Great Is Thy Faithfulness was 1953, I believe. But that would be definitely considered in our traditional hymnody category. So I'm including that along with public domain. If I would just say public domain, it would be 1923, and that would be fine. There's 97 songs there. I could then lump in those 3 with the 1955 area, but I'm just trying to show the encompassing traditional hymnody as opposed to the second category, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Did you say why 1987?
So 1987 is the shifting point harmonically and melodically, and so that's why, based on my research. I was talking to Dr. Toledo trying to figure out what was going on in the late 1980s, and there was something else he had mentioned, and I can't remember what it was, but it seems like around the late 1980s, things had started to shift anyway. When we think of PowerPoint and whatnot in the church, often the 1990s are where a lot of things started changing, but even prior to that, we're seeing, late 1980s that there was a shift. What else is interesting is as the internet takes over, we no longer are using hymnals as our filter. Prior to the internet, we didn't really have access to music so quickly. And so we had a natural filter through the hymnal. We were choosing songs from the hymnal, which have been vetted by a group of people that were thinking musically, were thinking theologically. That doesn't mean that every song in the hymnal was, excellent to sing, but they were thinking key area for the average congregant. They were thinking theological, passing that rigor. As we go to internet-based choosing, we no longer have the hymnal filter, and so the worship leader becomes the filter. And if the worship leader is not theologically sound and musically sound, that filter is going to just pass through anything that may not work for the congregation. And so for me anyway, that's why I see that music education and theological education is of utmost importance for a worship leader, so that their filter is stopping some of these songs from coming into the church that really aren't working so well for congregations. Yeah, John.
Do you think that 1987 would also be where the downward trend of congregations singing harmony began?
It's one of those, there's multiple factors, but as we lose harmonic complexity, there's less for harmony, there's less to even do harmonically. And so as we have simple harmonies, there's nothing really to sing harmonically. I mean, if I'm going to sing with 1, 6, 4, 5, I could sing 1, 1, 1, 7, and just hang out on scale degree 1 as I'm moving through those 4 chords. As we add chromatic harmonies, it shoves things up and moves things down, so you're getting more harmony, more interesting harmony. So I say it's kind of a combination of factor, but it's definitely the simplistic harmony that is driving us to lose harmony, singing in harmony. Yeah.
I've observed that in most of the churches, the youth finds the complex rhythms, they prefer complex
Right.
rhythms, and they learn it more easily compared to the adults. And so how do we balance it?
Right.
Our choice of songs.
Well, and this is where I feel that we can sing some of these songs in church, but you have to be more not aggressive, what's the word? More purposeful in teaching these songs to the church. We can't just sing them and assume they're going to figure out the rhythm. We have to be intentional about whether it's singing it for them first, whether it's simplifying some of the beat-displaced rhythms. Even though on the radio we hear it a certain way, that doesn't mean we have to sing it that way for a congregation. And this is where the oral tradition versus the written down tradition has really played a huge factor. If you would write these down, and as I show those rhythms, that's what you would see when you transcribe it on paper, and that's what happens when you print it off of Song Select. When you print the lead sheet, you see these funky rhythms. We sometimes normalize those rhythms in our mind anyway, or the congregation will often normalize those rhythms. And so we have to be attuned to that as well, and maybe give in to some of the rhythmic complexity and try to normalize some of those rhythms to make it a little bit easier for a congregation to sing. But I do think it's going to be more intentional of singing them more often if you're going to try to do it for congregational participation.
Well, is it really that the youth sort of have this capacity for learning it, or is it because they're listening to them already?
Right.
So they're just singing
Yeah.
what they've heard on the radio.
Well, exactly. And the problem becomes if you're assuming that your congregation is listening to the radio, first of all, a lot of them aren't. And second of all, things are changing so rapidly on the radio that unless you have like a 3-month period where that song was there on the radio, but as we change so quickly, it's becoming harder and harder to even keep up with the music. And then it becomes, too, how much can your church digest in a year of new music? As you keep bringing in new songs, how often are they going to be able to pick up on those? You might find that certain ones work, and then we can keep going with those. Other ones may not work, and being attuned to which ones seem to be more successful. But I think that's where the musical filter for the worship leader needs to say, you know what, this one's going to be a lot of work to put together. Is it even worth it to introduce it to the congregation? So, yeah, Samson.
What would you think would be the philosophical understanding?
Say again, Phil.
The philosophical underlying. I mean, something what actually made the shift in 1987?
Right.
A downward shift and the harmony and
Right.
upward shift.
So this is kind of what I'm surmising from this. Secular culture changed in the 1960s. Typically in churches it takes a generation for stuff that was in secular culture to infiltrate the church. You're also seeing those that grow up with this new music are now writing the music for the church. And so those that were growing up in the 1960s and 70s, that's what they're listening to, that's what they're hearing, that's what they're going to then write for the church. And so the church writers are writing what they're used to, or what they're used to hearing. And especially if they're not going on for musical training and things like that, they're going to work with what they know. And so I see that sort of is why it doesn't happen exactly the same time it happens in secular culture, but as the 60s and 70s in secular culture permeate those that are writing for the church, by the 1980s we start to see that coming out.
So there's a lot of great influence on the pop culture.
Right. And that's why I was showing in rock harmony, we see the same things happening with that corpus analysis of rock harmony. A lot of these 5-4-1 progressions are much more prevalent than the 4-5 progression, which is common practice tonality. We're also seeing the prevalence of root position chords, diatonic chords, which is also what we're seeing in the contemporary Christian worship.
What do you think on the study of like looking at how many of them, when they say write music, it's more of that they record it or something, and then I'd be curious to see how many of them actually know how to write the music.
Write it down.
Versus like
Right.
them just being able to record it and having someone else
Yeah.
go listen to it and say, okay, well now I got to do these complex rhythms because
Yeah.
you're singing it.
It's really easy for somebody to record something improvisatory and not having to have written down rhythm and meter and all of that. And so when we try to emulate that in the church, we're forced to figure out, okay, are we going to try to do it exactly like that artist? This is why I find, for instance, the Gettys. And I'll make a caveat here, and if we have a minute or two, I want to show. I've also researched the top 50 Getty songs and the top 50 Sovereign Grace songs because they are almost non-existent in the Corpus study. There is one Getty song in the Corpus, In Christ Alone, which is their most popular song, that made it into the Corpus. And Before the Throne of God Above for Sovereign Grace is in the Corpus. Those are the only ones. But what are they doing, and there's similarities. Notice with the Gettys, though, most of their music is written down in hymn style, so they're thinking about the rhythm of the hymn itself. They're thinking about key areas. And I had a couple of slides that I wanted to show here. As we think about these harmonies used, the Gettys, when we look at the 5-7 chord, notice the 5-7 becomes much more prevalent in the Gettys than it had been in 1987. So as they're writing, they're using a lot more 5-7 chords. Okay. The other thing I had mentioned is that there's actually a few songs that don't even use a 5 chord, which I think is kind of interesting. That's very different than traditional hymnody. The other thing is that they are using some chromatic chords, not as much as we've seen, but there is some chromatic chords. And if you look at like the swath of where they're going, there is a little bit more interest there. Sovereign Grace, I feel like, has a little bit more influence of contemporary worship writing, in that, again, the 5/7 chord is quite minimal there. So they do much more of the 5/4 progressions. They do use, however, more chromatic chords than we would see in the 1987, or 1988 to 2017. So if we factored these into this, we can see in those two groups particularly, they're doing some of the things that we would see more in traditional tonality. The other thing that we can see is they're writing much more for the congregation in mind, and actually slightly lower than the congregation. They go a lot to the A down here, and when we look at the span, even with the Gettys, there's quite a bit that are 17 semitones. It's right on that border of, comfortable. It could be comfortable, and most of that's because they go lower. They don't really get much, they don't hardly go, like it shows here, a D. They don't go at all above a D. Sovereign Grace goes a little bit higher, but again, their span seems to be more in line with what we've seen with traditional hymnody. And then finally, the key areas. The Gettys, although not as much in these key areas, a lot with the key of D and G, which again drives it up to a D for your melody line. So they're really consistent. Even when they go to the keys of A and E, they don't go up to that E, a high E in their original key. Sovereign Grace tends to have a little bit more with the sharp keys. Again, is sort of they're more towards the contemporary worship songs. I would say the Gettys would be more towards traditional hymnody based on the analysis from the corpus. But again, the Gettys write a lot of their stuff down. A lot of the contemporary worship songs aren't written down. They're more improvisatory and oral. So this actually bumps it up to 360 songs. That is the corpus. But I think it's important because a lot of people use Sovereign Grace and the Gettys. So.
I'd love to see you do an analysis of not only going a little one step further with the ranges,
yeah,
and looking at how long, how many times,
yeah,
where it stays.
The tessitura is another area which I can't, I could do it, but it's going to take a lot of effort with that. But the tessitura on most hymns are sitting in the mid-range, and they go up maybe once or twice to that D or E. The tessitura in most of the contemporary worship songs are sitting high or low. And so when you think of, yeah, even taking Indescribable in its original key, right? That's already high, and then you get... Right? It's just, you're just sitting in the rafters the whole way. So even if you were to modulate it down, we're going to get, let's see, yeah. It's still sitting in that high tessitura. So a lot of the songs, when you look at it, especially if they jump the octave in the second verse, they got a low tessitura here and then a high tessitura. It makes it harder to sing as a congregation with that tessitura. That is an area that would be fun to look at, but haven't read it.
I think with the Gettys too, like you were talking about how they go lower a lot. Well, a lot of the songs are written for Kristen.
Right, who's an alto, exactly. So their tendency is to be that way too. Yep.
All right, let's
cool.
Dr. Burggraff again.
Thank you.